Let's look at theme 6, Bhakti and Sufi traditions, changes in the religious beliefs and devotional texts from around the 8th century to the 18th century CE. Now, one of the most important things that emerges when we look at the 8th century religious beliefs, we see that there is an integration of cults which is happening, and there are two major processes at work. One, that the Brahmanical ideas are being disseminated through different ways, such as the Puranic texts and simple Sanskrit verse, which make it accessible to women and Shudras. So, where the lower categories in society are accepting Brahmanical norms, the other process is about Brahmins accepting and reworking beliefs and practices of the localized communities. Right. So, what this tells us is that there is a constant dialogue between what sociologists have described as the great Sanskritic Puranic traditions and the little traditions or the localized traditions. Now, the cult of Jagannath is an example of such an integration of cults. The cult of Jagannath we find originates in all probability in Orissa. And if you look at the iconography here, none of these gods look very familiar if you think about the Puranic pantheon. But what we today understand is that this particular image of Jagannath has been identified with Vishnu or more particularly Krishna. But you do not see a Sudarshan Chakra or even a flute, right? So, what is this? So, perhaps the attributes of the local culture of Jagannath sort of match somewhere with the Vishnu slash Krishna cults of the larger, greater Sanskritic traditions as well. So, perhaps the Brahmins appropriated this localized cult and said, well, Jagannath is no other than Vishnu, Krishna. Often, there was no direct acceptance of the local gods and goddesses, but what they do is they kind of include them in a Puranic framework. For example, you may look at a goddess and say, okay, so this goddess is perhaps the wife of a certain principal male deity. So you have Lakshmi, who emerges as the wife of Vishnu. In other instances, we have Parvati, or a goddess with her attributes, who has been called the wife of Shiva. So we see a large number of cults being integrated with each other in this way. Perhaps the Dashavatar was also an example of such integration of cults. We had a lot of difference and conflict within these different cults as well. Like, especially when we compare Vedic and Puranic traditions, we see a huge amount of difference. Like, for example, in the Vedic traditions, we have some important gods such as Agni, Indra, and Soma. Now, they were really important gods in the Vedic traditions. But by the time you reach the Puranic traditions, Agni, Indra, and Soma are, very marginalized, minor gods, often in need of help. From the new major deities such as Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh. Then again, when you go back to Vedic traditions, we hardly find any mentions of Vishnu or Shiva or the mother goddess, very few and far between references. But by the time we come to the Puranic period, we see that Vishnu and Shiva have become very major gods, and the tradition of the mother goddess has also expanded a great deal. There were also examples of conflict between these various religious beliefs. So you had the Vedic versus the Tantric. Now, the Vedic traditions were very strict in their rules and as to how you recite various mantras, whereas Tantricism was largely accessible to both men and women, and they also had a set of rules, but they were sometimes almost in opposition to the Vedic traditions. So the Vedic people never accepted the Tantric. They said they're too wild. The Tantric, they said, well, the Vedic traditions bind you like nothing else. Then you also have a juxtaposition between the Puranic or the Buddhist or Jain traditions. Yes, where the Buddhist and Jain traditions actually oppose a lot of the Puranic stories, especially those which deal with social hierarchies. And then you have the Puranic deities themselves being held in opposition to each other. Like, for example, Shaivism and Vaishnavism often were, quite inimical to each other. Now, we also see around the 8th century CE that the seeds of bhakti are being sown again through these three major cults, that is, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and Shaktism. Now let's look at early traditions of bhakti. For that, we'll have to go to southern India and look at two major groups here. But when you look at bhakti, they challenged Brahmins as intermediaries. They talked about direct access to God. Bhakti also accommodated women and low caste. For example, women and low caste were welcomed in the Bhakti fold. In fact, we have a large number of women and low caste saints also in these traditions. Now, when we look at bhakti, there are two large categories. So, one is Sagun Bhakti, that is where God is seen as someone with attributes, right? So, there are specific attributes that you give to your God. So, Shiva, Vishnu, and his avatars, or the forms of the goddess or the Devi, who are conceptualized in somewhat human-like forms. So they would be Sagun Bhakti. For example, Krishna Bhakti or Ram Bhakti, they would be Sagun Bhakti. Then you have the Nirgun Bhakti, where God is shown without attributes, or God is worshipped in an abstract form. Especially when you look at Kabir and Nanak's teachings, here they look at God being formless, right? So they were following the Nirgun tradition. So, coming to southern India, you had two major streams of bhakts. One were the Alvars and others were the Nayanars. Now, the Alvars literally meant that they were immersed in the devotion of Vishnu. Uh, so, that's the sect they followed. The Nayanars, on the other hand, were Shaivites. Now, both the Alvars and the Nayanars would identify certain shrines, marking them as homes or abodes of their chosen deities. And often in the later period, the ruling class would get large temples constructed to mark out these sacred places. And these temples emerged as centers of pilgrimage. And singing of compositions of these poet saints also became part of temple rituals in these shrines. And the kings also began to install the saints' images in these temples as well, where prayers were also offered. So, a number of South Indian temples, when you look at them, they really were hubs of the Bhakti movement. Now, what was the attitude of the Alvars and the Nayanars towards caste? Now, they all protested against the caste system. They were all against the domination of the Brahmins. And their followers included people from the highest levels to even untouchables. Now, one of the major anthologies of compositions by the Alvars, which is called the Nalayira Divya Prabandham, has often been described as a Tamil Veda. So, the Bhakti saints are also claiming that the texts that they produced were as important as the four Sanskrit Vedas themselves. As we said earlier, that the Bhakti movement was also open to women devotees and women saints. So we have two very important uh, women saints who emerged from southern India. One is Andal and the other is Karaikal Ammayar. So Andal was an Alvar, that is the beloved, she called herself the beloved of Vishnu, and wrote many poems describing her love for Vishnu. Karaikal Ammayar, on the other hand, was a Nayanar, or a devotee of Shiva, and she followed the path of extreme asceticism. Now, these women, when we look at them, they are really exceptional women because they renounce their social obligations. So, they would not be wives or daughters anymore. But at the same time, they did not join an alternative order or become nuns. They had kind of moved out of society, yet they did not want to belong to any community of renouncers. So, in fact, what scholars argue is that their very existence and their compositions actually posed a challenge to patriarchal norms. Yeah, so patriarchy didn't take very kindly to these kinds of women bhakti saints. Now, what was the relationship of the bhakti saints with the state? Now, when you look at the history of these movements, there are some major themes which emerge. One is that the Tamil bhakti hymns often are in opposition to Buddhism and Jainism. So, some scholars have argued that this was perhaps due to the competition between different members of the different members of the members of different religious traditions for royal patronage. Yes, so trying to win over a king's or a dynasty's support often could even mean the difference between survival and or the disappearance of a certain sect. Now, the Chola rulers, of course, patronized different gods at different times. So, most popular being Vishnu and Shiva. So, they supported the Bhakti traditions and they made large land grants and even constructed temples for their chosen deities. Some of the most magnificent Shiva temples are at Chidambaram and Tanjavur, and also at Gangai Konda Cholapuram, and these were constructed under the patronage of Chola rulers. In fact, they even had produced spectacular images of Shiva in bronze. And if you remember from class 7, they use the lost wax technique. right? So clearly the visions of the Nayanars were inspiring the artists as well. Now, both Nayanars and Alvars, because of the message they preached, they were revered by the Velala farmers. Now, obviously, rulers needed the support of their farmers as well. So, they tried to win over the support of the Bhakti saints, so that by extension, those who worshipped or respected these Bhakti saints would automatically become supporters of these rulers. The singing of Tamil Shaiva hymns in temples under royal patronage became quite popular, and the kings would take initiative to collect and organize all these hymns into a collective anthology of poems. Um, we also have inscriptional evidence from around 945 CE that suggests that the Chola ruler Parantaka the first had consecrated metal images of Appar, Sambandar, and Sundarar. These were some of the Nayanar Bhakti saints of the time in Shiva temples. And the images of these Bhakti saints were also carried in processions during the festivals of these saints, celebrating their birth and so on. Now, we also have the emanation of the Veerashaiva tradition, perhaps emanating out of the Nayanar tradition itself. Veerashaivas were also devotees of Shiva. They emerged around the 12th century in Karnataka. A Brahman called Basavanna is supposed to have been the founder of this community of bhaktas. And the word Veerashaiva means heroes of Shiva, and they're alternatively known as the Lingayats as well, or wearers of the Linga. Now, men usually wear a small linga in a silver case or a loop strung over the left shoulder, and they had great respect for jangamas or wandering monks. Now, the Veerashaivas believe that on the death of a devotee, they'll be united with Shiva and won't return back into the world, and therefore their funerary practices are also quite different. So, instead of cremation, they actually bury their dead. They also challenged the idea of caste and pollution, that certain people were polluted and therefore impure and therefore needed to be kept out of society. They also questioned the theory of rebirth, because when they said that they will never return to this world if a Shiva devotee dies. And then, of course, they were quite progressive in the sense that they advocated post puberty marriage and even the remarriage of widows. This was almost unheard of at that time. Now, we understand the Veerashaiva tradition from the vachanas, or the sayings composed in Kannada by men and women who joined the movement. Now, let's move on to northern India. Now, what is happening in northern India while the Bhakti movement is emerging in southern India? Now, northern India was in a state of flux, so we did have several Rajput states at this point of time, and in most of these states, it was the Brahmins who occupied positions of importance as very senior ministers and often performed a range of secular as well as ritual functions. But apart from the mainstream of the Brahmins, you also had the Naths, Jogis, and Siddhas, many of whom came from artisanal groups. So they had much more humble origins, including weavers. Weavers in northern India have always been considered to be low caste. So a lot of the Naths, Jogis, and Siddhas actually came from the weaving class as well. And they all questioned the authority of the Vedas. Now, the 8th century also marks the beginning of the first waves of the Turkish people coming in. And by the 13th century, the Delhi Sultanate is very well established and entrenched in northern India. And these bring about a whole lot of changes in the realm of culture and religion. And this is basically um, uh, facilitated by the advent of Islam and the coming of the Sufis. So let's look at Islamic traditions in northern India for a while. When we look at northern India and we look at these new rulers who are emerging now, so there is Muhammad Qasim, who's perhaps the first ruler of the Muslim ruler of the Indian subcontinent. He's the ruler of Sindh at that time, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughals. Here, all the rulers were followers of Islam, but it didn't necessarily mean that their subjects were all Muslims as well. Now, according to the ulama, the Muslim rulers should have been guided by the Sharia and themselves. But of course, we know that in India, the Muslim rulers had a vast majority of non-Muslim subjects. These non-Muslim subjects were called the Zimmi. So the non-Muslim subjects were called Zimmi, or the protected, and they were expected to pay the jizya, or a kind of a protection tax, much hated in the later centuries, as we shall see in some of the subsequent chapters. Now, from what we see is that the rulers often adopted a very flexible policy towards their subjects. we have examples of several rulers, right from the Delhi Sultanate into the Mughals, who gave land endowments, granted tax exemptions to Hindus, Jains, Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jewish religious institutions. And they also expressed respect and devotion towards non Muslim religious leaders as well. We know that Akbar made many such grants to non Muslim religious leaders, including Aurangzeb, as you would have studied in one of the sources. Now, let's look at some of the popular practice of Islam in the subcontinent. Now, when we look at Islam within the Indian subcontinent, we see that different people of different social strata actually adopted Islam. So, they could be peasants, artisans, warriors, merchants, a whole variety of people. Um, but one thing that was common between all Muslims, whether new converts or those who had come in from West Asia, was the five pillars of the faith. That is, that there is only one God, Allah, and Prophet Muhammad is his messenger. You should offer five prayers 5 times a day, give alms to the poor, fast during the month of Ramzan, and perform the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your lifetime. But we also see a lot of diversity, especially when we look at sectarian affiliations, for example, the Shias and the Sunnis. We also have local communities of Muslims who adopt local customs and traditions. For example, the Khojas, that is a branch of the Ismailis from the Shia sect, they developed new modes of communication where they disseminated ideas derived from the Quran through indigenous literary genres. For example, Ginan, meaning knowledge, or devotional poems in Punjabi, Multani, Sindhi, Kutchi, Hindi, and Gujarati. And these songs are often sung in special ragas during the daily prayer meetings in the mosque. Again, another example is that of the Arab Muslim traders who settled along the Malabar coast in Kerala. They adopted the local language of Malayalam. In fact, they translated the Quran into Malayalam. They even adopted local customs such as matrilineal, that is a lineage being considered through the mother's line, and matrilocal residence as well, something that was quite unfamiliar to the actual Islamic world. But there was also some universality and diversity. So, the universal practices that we've seen were the five pillars of Islam, but there were some other things also which were very common, especially in the construction of mosques. So, some common features were that the mosques were always oriented towards Mecca. So you would have the mihrab, which would point out the direction where Mecca was, so that the faithful could face Mecca while they offered their prayers. And also the minbar, or the pulpit, from where the religious leaders would give their sermons. But of course, we also see a lot of diversity in how these mosques were built in terms of the roof structure and building material. So, if you look at this image, this is a mosque from Kerala. So, this is a very traditional way of construction in Kerala. So, they were using traditional methods of Kerala to build their mosques. Then this is, of course, one of the mosques from Kashmir. This is made of wood, and again, if you look at the roof, it's very different in structure. Yes, so this also has sloping roofs. Whereas if you look at Jama Masjid of Delhi, this structure is quite different from the other two, where you have a flat roof with domes and minars and so on and so forth. Right. So mosque kind of really came to exemplify both universality and the diversity of the Islamic religion. Now let's look at names for communities. Now, when we look at the 8th to the 14th century, the term Musalman or Muslim was virtually never used when we look at the texts of the time. Instead, people were identified terms of the region that they came from. So, the Turkish rulers were designated as Turushka, Tajika were the people who came from Tajikistan, and Parashika were people from Persia. Sometimes terms are also used for new migrants. For example, Turks and Afghans were referred to as the Shakas and Yavanas as well. Initially, where Yavanas came to signify the Greeks, but the old terms were being used to signify new migrants as well. We also have the term Lech, which indicates that these communities, these migrant communities, did not observe the norms of a Brahmanical caste society and also spoke languages that were not derived from Sanskrit. Um, Today, of course, the term Lecha has more derogatory connotations, but at that time, it didn't even signify a particular religion. I mean, Lecha could be anybody who does not conform to Sanskritic language and caste norms, right? And the term Hindu also was non-existent in the 8th to the 14th centuries. And if it was used more in a regional sense. So anybody who came from the east of the Sindh River or from Hindustan was a Hindu, irrespective of what religious community they belonged to.